animators, and artists. Hilda is an animated series adapted from Luke Pearson's graphic novel by Silvergate Media and Mercury Filmworks. Today we're speaking with director Andy Coyle and assistant director Megan Ferguson about their work on the series. Andy, Megan, welcome to the interview.
Hi, thanks for having
Hi.
us.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
So before we really get into this, I just wanted to do a quick introduction. Andy, what does a typical day in the role of a director look like?
It can vary quite a bit, actually. I mean, there's a lot of different moving pieces when you're trying to make an animated series that spans a large amount of time because animation is a slow and laborious process. So um, it can start with dealing with script revisions and breaking down scripts for getting them ready to be produced. There are, every step along the way, things to be done from storyboards to designs to then animatics and editing and voice records and moving into prepping backgrounds and character builds and animation, compositing effects. It continues on, and at times, sometimes you're doing all of those things all at once, especially in the middle of making a season of television. It gets kind of hectic because you could be sort of wrapping up pre-production on the last episodes, and then in the middle of production of the middle episodes and starting post-production on the first episodes, and you are in a sort of cyclone and whirlwind of trying to juggle all of these different things. So it can vary greatly, but for the most part, it's just sort of guiding and helping to strategize and be sort of the creative architect of how each of these pieces are going to be executed and then come together as like a whole thing, which is actually the hardest part of doing all of it, is trying to coordinate and get each little piece of that puzzle of the show to fit together into a cohesive, enjoyable whole.
I think it's really interesting because a lot of people who watch animated series might not realize that a production schedule could be staggered in that way, where you have people working on pre-production episodes as the rest of the episodes are going into production and post-production.
Yeah, that's the crazy part of it is because each of these processes take so much time that if you tried to separate them all out and only individually focus on one little thing at a time, it would take you a year and a half to make an episode. So you have to sort of try and manage the flow of work and keep on top of a large team of people all working together to try and achieve that same goal, which anybody who's done that job knows it's just a large undertaking to try and get everyone on the same page and have a nice, satisfying result at the end of the process.
And Megan, what does a typical day in the role of an assistant director look like?
I mean, I've worn a lot of hats kind of over the course. Both me and Andy have sort of done that. I would say a lot of my role is really being like beside our heads of departments and supervisors to help them balance, problem solve. We have these really challenging artistic goals, and I think what I tend to kind of do is use my more analytical side to kind of help make that efficient, because it is doing something like Hilda and getting people on the same page and making it consistent and being able to have the room to allow people to do the quality that the show needs and the heart that it needs for people to kind of like have that room. It takes a lot of problem solving, a lot of planning, a lot of support and guidance. And that's something that we've really learned along the way. And that's primarily what I kind of do is like, we have our sort of goal of what we want to do for the episode. And depending on the challenges, what I'll do is I will, help the different departments do like, hey, like, let's try to do it this way. Or if we do it this way, then it will be easier for this department further down the line. I have more of a broader scope of the cause and effect of the choices that we make. So I try to really keep that in mind at any given stage, even in the very beginning in design. I'm trying to be efficient in how we design and guiding our design team so that when we get to animation, it works for our animators. So there's a lot of collaborative process, and which is difficult but extremely rewarding. A lot of our departments are in contact with each other, and it's one of the advantages we have, basically being able to do it all in the studio.
So we're here today because we're talking about Hilda, and I wanted to ask, how did you join the project, and what did the early meetings look like?
Well, it happened a long time ago in what feels like a completely different world.
In the far away, the before times.
Yeah. It was, I think it was like 2014, if I remember correctly, when I had been working on, various television series in the studio. And at the time, we would get sort of a lot of submissions and contacts, pitches from production companies and other artists and things to sort of say like, hey, would you guys like to work with us on this thing? Or what do you think about this? And so we always had this ongoing pile of properties and materials that we would like, there was a group of us that would just go through them and see if there was anything cool that ever popped up. And it was just one of those days running through the pile. I had come across these books, Luke's books. And at the time, there was only 3 of them, I think. So it was instantly when I read it, I was like, oh, hell yeah, this is really cool. And very interesting as an idea to adapt into a children's television series. And so I just immediately was like, where did this come from? Who submitted this? What is this? And it was brought to us by Silvergate Media, who had the executive producer of the show, had just found the book in a bookstore and was like, this is awesome. This would make a really cool TV show. And then had optioned it and then started going around trying to see like, okay, well, who could help us make this into a TV show? And so immediately I just sort of felt like I got a real good take on this. So we just got on the phone and just sort of bantered around some general ideas of like, what was it we wanted to make? And we settled on this idea of putting together a quick demo, like a little short 60-second pilot idea, just to sort of test bed out some of this stuff and see what could a show, how would you adapt these things? What could it be? Which the possibilities were all over the place at that time. We also didn't want to spend a whole bunch of money and go crazy with it. So it was fast and furious. We just real quick came up with this idea and hammered out a general look and started building this stuff up, cut it together. And at the end of it, everybody felt like that's really cool. And that could be a great TV show. I think it also provided like the benefit, at least for me, of everything that I didn't want to do. I sort of worked out in that demo where I was like, okay, now looking back on it after I finished it, I would change a lot of how I sort of handled it and how I interpreted it. And so luckily from that point, the process of pitching the show around in the industry took a little while because it was a bit of a strange idea at the time to pitch a show like this, and it was trying to find like the right home for it, and that took a couple of years. And through those couple of years, it lived like in my head, where I was able to go over and over all of the choices that I made and say like, oh no, I'll do it this way. I'll try this. And so I was always sort of like noodling around with what I would love to do with the show, should it ever get the lucky chance to be turned into a reality. And then it happened. You know, we had a couple of scripts that we had put together. Our wonderful writer Stephanie Simpson, who had adapted Luke's Midnight Giant book into this wonderful script, was sort of our tent pole of like, okay, this is what we want the show to be. And to me, that script in particular was like incredibly clear and really, and we had time to like play with it and really find the voice of the show with that. And so it felt like, again, the benefit of the time that we had to live with the stuff really helped us know what our voice for the show was going to be when we started pre-production on season 1. So yeah, it was a long process and overall exciting and very anxious, because it was not, you know, like we said, we didn't know, was this ever going to find a home? Were we ever going to be able to produce this show? And it was always like, oh, we almost got there. And then it was like, the deal's not going to work out. And we had sort of had a couple of close calls. And then when Netflix came into the picture, this was very early in sort of the Netflix producing original content era, where we thought, oh, well, that's an interesting idea. That could be a great place for the show to exist. And it was. So it worked out in our favor.
So in the whole chronology, Megan, at what point did you join the project?
I think I came in, they were just starting storyboard revisions on the very first episode, like the 2-parter on the first episode. I remember I was coming off of the Tangled series. I was an animation supervisor on the first season of Tangled for a bit, and then I kind of came off of it because I was sort of in this spot where I was like trying to figure out what next steps I wanted to take. You know, I felt like a little bit in a rut, like what do I want to do next? And actually, I was super into Tangled. I was actually working on some Tangled scenes as I was working on Hilda, and be like, hey, Andy, look at how dramatic this is. You know, because I love the song sequences. But yeah, I went down to Burbank actually to meet some of the team there, and Chris Sonnenberg, who is the executive producer. He was always very open to like chatting with me, and he gave me like the tour of the studio, and he asked me, because we were just chatting, he's like, have you ever thought about directing? And I had kind of directed a demo like before, and I didn't really have a good experience because like I didn't quite know what a director did at the time, because I was just in animation. I just wasn't prepared, and I had never really thought about it. But I think what I realized was like I want to learn more before I direct, and I do want to have more of a voice in the things that I work on. I don't want to just, you know, feel like I am sort of like going through the motions. So that talk really like helped me kind of think about where I wanted to go. And when I came back from my vacation to the studio, Andy at that point was, Hilda was looking for an animation director, and basically it was the perfect thing that I had wanted to hear, which was we need someone who can just take this and run with it and have a voice and, you know, bring their own opinion to the table. And that was sort of the thing that clenched it for me, because I wouldn't say I have like any sort of like big aspirations to direct or really be the head of something, but I always want to grow and learn and, you know, figure out how to help people. And so it was just really refreshing to kind of be able to like, yeah, if you're going to come into this position, you're going to be in charge of it and you got to figure out how to do it. And I was like, that sounds great. And with that being said, I got a ton of mentorship. It was amazing to be in the same office as Andy and just sort of like absorbing all of his knowledge and his like film aesthetic. And just, it was amazing in the first season. But yeah, I started on, I came onto storyboards. I had never storyboarded before, but I started helping out with revisions. And that was kind of the start of doing the transfer from someone who was primarily just in animation and just focused on character animation to having a much broader view of how production worked, and which is amazing. So yeah, I was really lucky to get in very, very early and be a part of the core team on that first season.
And Megan, for those in our audience who haven't seen Hilda before, and honestly, if you haven't, maybe just pause this video, turn on Netflix, watch an episode, and then come back. But how would you describe how Hilda was pitched to you?
I think Hilda wasn't really pitched to me because like I had seen the short that they had, like I'd seen the demo. And I was drawn to it immediately. And I think that was why it was sort of like a no-brainer, because not only would I have like someone who would like allow me to have an opinion, but it felt nostalgic. It really kind of like, it was so appealing and so beautifully crafted and more minimalist. And I think it sort of helped me figure out like what aesthetic I like in animation as well. And it really, I think it was this nostalgic feeling for me when I saw this, because I was like, wow, look at this demo. I've never seen it before. And yet I have this sense of nostalgia and this sense of like, yeah, like feeling like a kid again. And I think that's the charm overall of the whole show. You kind of don't need to super pitch it. You just need to watch a bit of it. And hopefully you feel what we're going for. And I really think that, you know, as much as, you know, Andy may look back at it and go, I would change things. The spirit is still the same. It's always been the same. And that's what really drew me to wanting to like dive in headfirst to this project.
So, Andy, I know you mentioned that Hilda is a little bit unlike a lot of projects that you've worked on in the past. In what ways was Hilda challenging for traditional cable networks to bring in?
Well, it was the idea that it's an animated series that isn't a comedy for primarily aimed at like an 8 to 12 demographic, which is difficult, especially at the time. Now I think there's much more in the field for that particular age group that has been sort of shown. Like, yeah, there is a real viable audience there who are interested in things other than cartoons being more comedic. But I think that was part of it. And there were not a ton of straight adventure shows that were animated. So it became, that was a challenge, not just for selling the show, but for making the show as well, in that it required us to sort of approach it a completely different way than how we were approaching the content that we were used to making, which were sort of 11-minute runtime slapstick cartoons, and primarily aimed at boys as a target demographic. And sort of we wanted to make something that was more universal and didn't have to sort of play in that box at all. That I knew there was an appeal that kids got from stories that didn't have to be, they didn't have to couch everything in sort of like this tongue-in-cheek sarcasm, that you could be really sincere with the material and connect with kids on a real level, that the audience is capable of processing that kind of cinema. And it was something that when I was a kid, I really connected with stuff that wasn't comedic. And I knew that that was possible. So it was just a matter of figuring out, now, how do I do that in animation with a bunch of people who have never tried to do that before? And it really was a process of getting everybody on board to try things differently than how you normally do them, which is that can induce a lot of anxiety in people, when you're like, well, no, that's not the way we do things. That's not how we make this stuff. And you have to sort of say, look, well, let's try to do this differently. I know we could just fall back on the same old ways things are done, but instead, let's go in a different direction. And maybe it won't work, but I feel like it will. And if you guys trust me a little bit, let's take a shot at it and see how it works. And I felt confident enough in it to really commit and go for it, because I knew there was an audience for that kind of stuff. And I knew that it would translate well across different demographics and different kinds of people. If we could tap into some kind of real truth, real sincerity with the characters and the stories, that wouldn't matter how old you are or where you were from, that you could watch the show and really get it. So, and luckily, it worked out in the end. When we put out that first season, no one really knew if that was going to connect properly with anybody. We kind of made our 13 episode adventure, and we thought, okay, great. We're so proud of it. And it was, it was a lot of work, but we put our hearts out there, and hopefully this is enjoyed by people. And then the response was sort of interesting, where it was very overwhelmingly positive. And so we didn't expect quite that level of a reception. And it really encouraged us to say, okay, I guess we're on to something maybe. And then Netflix was like, well, let's make some more. Let's do this again. And we thought, okay, well, if we're going to continue this, what are we going to do? Because we absolutely did not want to just do the same thing over again. And so we set out to do a variation on the theme and evolve the show a little bit. We knew from the get-go, this is a show, while it's a fantasy about magical creatures and adventures and things, it's really a show about growing up. It's a show about that time in your childhood where you're sort of not quite a kid anymore, but you're not an adult at all. And you're sort of transitioning in sort of trying to figure out who you are in the world. And so we knew it would feel really strange if the characters were static and stagnant, that they didn't grow, they didn't change. We kept repeating the same things over and over again. So we thought, okay, with season 2, let's make it a little older, a little darker. Let's age this show with the audience that's watching it. And it also came out of this concern of like, well, the way we had sort of started the show is we weren't this big, tentpole media property. It was this little obscure thing. So no one knew we were going to do more. So by the time everybody was like, let's do another season, it had been, the season 1 had been out already. So we had to get started on a second season and produce it. So there was going to be a bit of a gap between the seasons. And we thought, man, there's a pretty big difference to a kid. Like if you're 7 years old when season 1 comes out, you're 9 when season 2 comes out. And that may not seem like a big deal for someone who's maybe 27 to 29, but 7 to 9, you're really growing and changing in your understanding of how the world works. And so we thought, let's keep this show evolving with our audience. And so, we intentionally, with the first episode of the second season, sort of laid it out for everybody and did a show that was like very against type. It was an action show version of what Hilda is, and it didn't have a super happy wrapped up ending. It was that we were exploring the theme of like deception and introducing all these new elements in Eric Alberg and the Safety Patrol, and escalating just the intensity of some of the stuff. And then we knew going into the second season that we didn't want to have a massive gap in content between if we were to get another third season. So we had sort of been early in talks with Netflix about the idea of following up the second season with a big event movie. And sort of, so we knew going into the scripting of the second season that, okay, we're going to leave it on a cliffhanger with the idea that we feel pretty confident we're going to get either this idea of this movie, or we'll be able to do a third season. And luckily Netflix really liked the idea of wrapping it up in a big special event like that. So we knew as we were making season 2 that like this is going to lead us into the biggest, most ambitious project that we've ever taken on. And it's a pretty big leap going from 11-minute slapstick cartoons or preschool cartoons to doing a 90-minute feature film for a team, that's, trying to figure out how do we create something and sustain it for this long and really commit to our standard of quality while not having a $200 million budget. You know what I mean? Like we weren't.
Was that
making
the first feature film at Mercury?
Yeah, it was our first feature film that we made completely in-house. So we've dabbled on like other feature films, but just in sort of supportive roles and doing little bits here and there. But Hilda and the Mountain King was a massive endeavor when it comes to just even the pre-production and coming up with this movie. The story department, it was an undertaking as an understatement. We didn't want to make something that was boring. We didn't like, the danger of doing stuff like that is always like, well, I mean, we have to adjust our approach, because if it's just a 22-minute episode that's stretched out, then that feels like you're going to lose people. The pacing will become boring, and you need to infuse a certain amount of ambition and scope to something of that scale when it comes to that runtime. And then you just have to try and balance, like, how do I achieve that without these endless resources that the sort of big mainstream animated features have? How do we come up with clever ways around some of these limitations and achieve the desired effect that we need to give people the real dramatic reward and the storytelling that we need to engage people with something that feels satisfying after we're done. It was a real complex process and very exhausting and enlightening. And ultimately, I think I'm so proud of the work that we did. It's like the culmination of everything we had been learning and trying, and we put it all to use as a team. And everyone who worked on the movie was like committed to it, and there was no more of this sort of like second guessing of like, do we need to do things this way, or couldn't we just do it the old way? Everyone was like all in, and we all believed in this, and it showed when we all sat down to work and it came together in a way that I'm super proud of. So I think if you haven't watched the show yet, start with the show and you'll get to the movie, and it'll be a rewarding payoff for everything that we built in the first 2 seasons.
So there has been like historically a divide between TV animation and feature animation, and I think there's less of that now. But Megan, I wanted to ask you, how was Hilda similar to or different from other projects that you've worked on?
Oh, it was a completely different show. Like, generally, at least pretty much my career up until Hilda, like I had been working on a lot of, service projects. And which is absolutely, like, I've gained so much experience from working on so many different types of shows, but I've never, the one thing about working on Hilda that was super new to me was, and the thing that I think has really lent itself to all the learning and the building and the growing that we've done, because we haven't improved over the years, right? Like, it's totally different. We have totally different processes now from when we started, is the ability to have our pre-production and our production departments understand and know each other and be able to preemptively like foresee problems. Like my experience is purely in animation and Toon Boom animation in particular. So I know the ins and outs of Toon Boom. I know what sort of, like if I look at a storyboard, I can go, okay, well, this would be really hard to pull off in Toon Boom exactly in this way. But if I adjust it here, it'll turn a little bit differently. So I had all this knowledge of how to execute animation in a effective way. And it really helped in the storyboard phase because I was able to, again, sort of like guide or adjust. Like I naturally don't always do board panels because I know I can't pull it off in animation, right? So I already start making different choices. And I think that's where it was super different, but in a super positive way, because I could support teams further down the line with my knowledge of how they worked and start implementing that and teaching that to other departments. And that was something I'd never had a chance to do before, because when you're sort of on the back end of a service production, you kind of got to work with what you have. Not to say you can't problem solve, but if there is an episode that has extremely complex shots, like, yes, you can storyboard, but there's still expectations with how the animation works, how they expect it to look, and those choices and those expectations aren't always the most efficient, which is fine. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with like a challenge. We have them on Hilda too, but I think that made it a much different experience. I want to try to solve as many problems and try to like fix the things I've always wanted to fix before. Like as an animator, I'd always be like, oh no, it's one of those shots again, or like I'd have these like the kind of the pain in the butt shots. And now I'm like, oh, I have the power to not have those, So it was really great to be able to have that control. And because Hilda is a show that we are trying to do things differently and the quality is high, every single piece of efficiency that we can put in is needed to pull off the final product. Absolutely. Like it is constant problem solving, constant efficiently, constant. How can we get this quality, but do it in a way where, no one's like banging their head against the wall? A shot that like, I mean, I could go on forever too about the amount of planning I do and the documents we make in order for the process to be smooth, especially even like the Mountain King, for example. How do we pull off that quality in these big scope things with the budget we have and the time that we have? And all of it is knowledge based off of our experience in the service industry and applying that to our front end stuff. And you can do it while not stifling creativity. That's the thing, right? It's like you can do these things, you can be efficient, you can tone it down, and still come up with like this amazingly creative and sincere and genuine and clean and consistent show, right? Like it can be done. It's a lot of brain power, but it can be done. So that was the most rewarding thing.
So what you're saying is that it's not really so much about never sweating over the details in a scene, but really like sweating over and putting all the craft into the scenes that you feel really matter.
Yeah. Oh, I sweat the details because for me, I really think it's important, especially as like when, I'm assistant director now, as animation director on the other seasons, is like, I know what quality I need from animation. If there are shots in the show that I don't know how to pull off, or I don't know like how I would do it, I'm going to solve that problem immediately and give guidance to my team. And that doesn't mean they can't do it a different way, but at least we have to have a start, because when you are used to working in on the back end of a service show for a long time, a lot of the way you are trained, a lot of animators are used to kind of, it's more about like production and quantity sometimes of scenes. And it really, you can't just snap your fingers and ask people to problem solve in complex ways to pull off these large shots. Most people will just kind of go, oh, that's a big shot, I guess I just got to jump into it. So it's like giving them a base of like, hey, I've problem solved all the difficult things for you. Now you can be creative. Now you can like really think about the acting. Now you can think about the composition, because the technical side of it has already been thought through, and our choices have complemented that. For example, we have our ghost ship episode in the second season, and we have ghosts and they're transparent. And I know that transparency with a bunch of different builds in Toon Boom does not make for an easy scene to animate, especially when you have several of those builds. So because I have that knowledge, I collaborated with our design department, with our builds department, and we worked together to create basically a lot of choices of what's going to be a PNG group shot, what's going to be a special build, what are the animators going to do, what are the designers going to do. And when you look at it, it looks great and cohesive and clean. But a lot of those things aren't all rigs. A lot of those things are just background PNGs or very, very limited rigs. But it's those specific choices as a director that you can make in order to get the quality you want without overloading your creative teams with some of the technicalities that come from working in Harmony.
Yeah, and we have some examples too that we have here. I'll show you guys a couple of images.
Amazing.
Just to show some of the process of like, this is something Megan's talking about too, which is the idea that we're trying to squeeze every ounce of efficiency that we can, and then we pour that back into the creative endeavor of the show. And so when I come up with these shots of like, oh, I'm going to have like 40 kids all standing around in a crowd while Alberg delivers a speech, you have to start to think about like, okay, how does that actually happen in reality when we get into production? And you can see that we sort of break down these shots into the most bare minimum that we have to do in order to achieve the illusion and create the feeling of the shot. And so in this particular shot, you can see we have these sort of like big wide overhead shots, and we just draw the artwork into those scenes. It's simple and basic, and it doesn't need to move because there's a lot going on there. And then we have very limited small amounts of animated elements that we build, and they're unique to that scene. We design the scene especially to pull that kind of an idea off. And then the same thing applies for like other crowd shots where you can sort of build out. I'll zoom in a little bit here, and you can see that we build these very simplified background shapes. We start to pepper in held still artwork that will create the illusion that there's more people there. And then you have an element on top of that, which you can replace with fully articulated animated Harmony rigs. And this is all planned out. And you can see we draw this stuff in to give specific instruction to exactly where to place everything so you can pull this illusion off. And then you have a much easier scene to pull off in a digital pipeline. And you can see some little close-up stuff here, how this sort of works. We have like a lot of little things like that we try to do to pull this stuff off. Even when it comes to like simple problems where you'd be like, okay, how do we do this? This is just an example of a thing where what we'll do is we'll paint two different backgrounds. One is lit by this flashlight. One is sort of the base darkened colors. You have an animated character that you duplicate, have one as a dark version, one as a fully lit version, use a matte shape to color it away, and you create from these pieces of artwork the illusion of a flashlight being cast upon a background and revealing our fully articulated animated character. And it's just a lot of this sort of fun, clever solutions to the problems. And sometimes we get like pretty ambitious, where in the first episode of season 2, I really wanted to do something that I felt like I never quite hit on the first season, which was I wanted to play a real-time sunset as it happens in the scene, because I felt like it's such a cool, dramatic opportunity when we have these creatures, these trolls that come alive when the sun isn't cast upon them. And that wind up, that countdown is part of like the meat of the scene. And it was like, okay, well, how do you do a real-time sunset over the course of like a minute of screen time using animation? And we sort of came up with a system where we had created basically doubles of the backgrounds. So we would paint an A version of the key, which is sort of just a regular stock daytime look. And we would paint a B version of the key, which is a more sunset version of where we wanted to end up as the target color design to reflect twilight. And then we could layer them on top of each other in harmony and use a transparency node to fade and gauge ourselves scene by scene. Where are we on the spectrum of this idea of the sunset, right? And on top of that, you have to start thinking about like, well, it can't just be hard cuts from scene to scene. We have to sort of massage and animate these elements. So what we did was separate out all the sky bands, and you can watch the scene and have it slowly articulating, animating down as if the sky's sort of losing its light. Every shadow layer in the background was separated out into a solid RGB fill that we built in Harmony and rigged with perimeter deformers to be able to subtly animate the shadows getting longer and creeping down the side of the troll and across the ground. And then those are comped into the scene to create this illusion. And all of that throughout this minute of screen time is a really subtle and interesting, dramatic visual experiment to wind the audience up, just to like get them to that moment where you know it's coming, you know the trolls are coming alive and the characters aren't quite catching these subtle details, and then you give them a big payoff, and we break into a really satisfying climactic action sequence. But all of that has to be like meticulously planned in advance, because if you just pose this idea to an animation team, it will make people's heads explode. They just go, what? How are we doing this? This is impossible. And it's just a very complex set of different ideas to try and achieve these results. You can see we did some like sort of pre-production scene key mock-ups, which we like to do as well, where we articulate everything in the scene. We finish our background. We place in drawings of our characters. We do the compositing and the color designing and the lighting and the specific treatments that we want for these sequences, so that we can provide that to the production of the show and say, look, this is what a final frame of this show needs to look like. And let's take a look at what we need to do in our pipeline to be able to to achieve this look. And it's been just a process of like setting our creative goals and then being able to find ways to pull that off.
Yeah, this is wild, and I really love seeing all of the craft that goes into the animation and compositing in this show. Megan, you mentioned that there are a few things that you gave as guidance to storyboard artists on the show to make things a little bit easier with cutout animation. What are some things, since we have storyboard artists in our audience, what are some things that you would recommend avoiding?
I would say probably one of the things that is the most difficult to do and have it look good is a character with camera moves. Generally, you have to have animation on one so it doesn't strobe with the camera moves. I've worked on shows where the animation, is fuller, is more traditional looking. There's rotations, there's stuff, having characters rotate in like not just in a small rotation, but like a 360 or a 180 while a camera is moving is the hardest thing, because with harmony rigs, you can't get, it's hard to get a smooth rotation sometimes. And when you have to put it on ones to limit strobing, it is just like, whew, it's one of those shots. I would say that's probably like the peak difficulty. I think a lot of things too, like even just knowing how rigs work a lot of the times when I am doing storyboards, or even when I am working on a show that maybe has some more flexibility with the storyboards. Not every show is like as strict, like, oh, follow the boards like this. So for shows that are a little bit more have a little bit more flexibility, I often tell animators like, hey, when you look at the board, see what the character is kind of doing. Oftentimes it's easier to have a character just look behind their shoulder instead of turning around completely, because that turn that you're doing is like way more work than just turning the head, and it looks just as natural, if not more natural, to just kind of turn the head. Now that all obviously depends on who's in charge of the show, what their expectations are, but just things like that I often like kind of make a note of that, so I can tell the animators, just turn the head, don't turn the whole body, But it's those sort of choices, especially for having the experience in animation that I do. I know that a lot of the appeal of a scene comes from the focus of the scene. You don't have to do everything amazing, but you do have to make your main focus look good, right? And sometimes when people move you have to be aware of the limitations of the rigs and the limitations sometimes of the the program, because those boundaries are good. It actually helps you with creative problem solving. You start kind of find better ways to be efficient. But it's that kind of stuff. It comes from being confident to kind of make those choices of, yes, I know the board has a character turning, but what's the main point of the scene? What's the acting? Well, it's more in the face. It's more in the, we want to look at that. So we try to, keep that in mind with storyboards, but with Hilda, at least our storyboards are not meant to be a strict guideline for the animators. So even if we don't catch them all, they have the flexibility. Our animation supervisors and animation director have the flexibility to adjust those things. But for the larger kind of more technical shots, definitely, keep an eye out for any kind of big rotations with camera moves is generally the thing that will make an animator go home at the end of the day just very, very bummed out.
Yeah, but it is really cool when you have a production where the directors and everybody involved in pre-production understands that there are certain limitations with the medium. Where, I think one of the cliches is when you have a showrunner come on who has no experience in animation, they'll make statements in publicity that's like, in animation we can do everything. In animation we have an unlimited special effects budget, and no.
That's you need to have the medium that you choose to do in animation, because animation is a genre, animation is a medium, not a genre. there's a lot of different things you can do, but like if you are like if you're you're going to hand draw it, or if you're going to send it to like a different studio to in between, or if you're going to use Harmony, if you're going to use Flash, you need to know and the limitations and at least something about that process in order to temper your expectations. We know what the limitations are, so we can kind of get around those hurdles in order to get the outcome that we want. If you don't know what the limitations are, you could be asking for things that actually are going to give you a worse quality than if you had known the limitations and then worked within those boundaries, and you can get a better quality. And that's sort of the core of a lot of our choices, right? Like, we will get better work if we understand the limitations and problem solve up front.
Yeah.
So
just because you can
speaking of choices,
just because you can do something doesn't mean you should either, in terms of the storytelling of your show, where you need to have a real clarity of focus of like, what is it you're trying to say with this? And then what achieves that? There's probably a lot of different options for solutions that would achieve what it is you're trying to say. And that if you have any understanding of the craft of creating that stuff, you can make choices that are appropriate creatively and technically. And you start to be able to wring efficiencies out of the process of making it that allow you to put all of that back on the screen. For every hour you're not spending twiddling with this big wide shot of a character doing all the encapsulated action, and you've saved that time by just cutting it into 2 shots where you can cut away to different easier actions, you're spending all that time now on the actions themselves and making them satisfying and rewarding. And it really is one of the big advantages that we've had in making the show, is that it's like this sort of very connected, cohesive team that understands the process.
So speaking of like making choices and understanding the strengths of the medium, what was the process of adapting the original illustrations in Luke Pearson's work to character designs for a TV production?
It was a process of obviously critically analyzing the source material and saying, like, okay, what is the heart of this work? How do we capture the insides of it? We don't need to superficially copy it. We don't need to imitate the comic. And in fact, the comic doesn't imitate itself. I think the comic evolves over issues and sort of looks different from issue to issue, and has ended up looking like very similar to where the show has ended up looking. But it's a process of figuring out what is the heart of the characters, what do we need to have present, and what do we not need to have present. And in the design of the show, which isn't just about the characters either, I think the whole world of the show was connected in that way, where we were thinking, what is the appeal here? And so obviously this is a show that showcases sincere emotional performance from our characters. So we knew, like, in the layout of the face, we needed to exaggerate the eyes. We needed to create sort of like these features that we could really clearly and deliberately display emotion with their faces in a way that was very flexible for animation. So the more detail, not the better. You wanted to be able to pare it down to its basic elements and then use that as a tool for clarity. There's nothing in the show that is noise. We're not just overloading things and putting stuff in because it's visually stimulating. That's not what we want on the show. We want to be very minimalist and very clear because we want to use the visuals as a storytelling tool. It's not just to blast your eyeballs with a bunch of cool stuff. It is to bring you in to the story visually and play things out in ways that are very difficult to do with dialogue or to script out. You know, we want to be more subtle. We want to play with really different degrees of emotion, and so the world was a big part of that. Where from the get go, my primary sort of goal was to say we need to embellish our lighting in the show. Like that cinematic lighting is a integral part of telling stories visually in cinema. Imagine if you were a live action director and they said to you, yeah, okay, but you can't have any lighting in your film. You would say, oh, well, that's going to be incredibly difficult for me to compose any kind of visual storytelling. It puts a really small box on what you can do. And I felt like, especially at the time of sort of coming up with the design of Hilda, that animation had sort of boxed itself in really tightly with picking other areas of appeal to try and embellish and not focusing on that idea, which to me was a very important element of the show, of this kind of a show, was the mood and the atmosphere, and achieving that through composition and color and light and shadow. And so I went into it saying, okay, well, what I don't need is a bunch of rendering and textures and brush strokes and crazy things. But what I do need is deliberate light and dark values, and to be able to use those things in the shots in a sophisticated way. So we paired everything back. It was like, do we need that button on that shirt? No, get rid of it. Okay, good. Because what we're going to do is have a light that can be able to be animated on the character, and that we're saving ourselves all of that that labor of like tracking all of those minute details, with the idea that we're going to spend that effort on the stuff that really, really matters. And it's a balance of trying to find, like, what do we need to pull off here? What do we need to draw from? And then what can we sort of embellish to create our points of appeal for the show? Not everything has to be all in all the time. You can focus your ideas and come up with a really interesting visual language. And I have a thing too in these images that articulate some of like the color design of the show, which I think it's somewhere around here. We had a bunch of stuff from, actually, let me pull it up in the production design. Yeah, here's a nice one. So you can see here this idea that the world is connected. Everything is recursive in the show, which is like it's a fun extrapolation of what sort of the comic was drawing from, in that, you know, in older comics, colors cost money. So you try to limit the amount of colors you're using, which is a nice, fun sort of aesthetic for comics. But then when I saw sort of like that idea starting to crop up, I started thinking, oh, well, you know, that could actually be used in a creative way to create a cohesion in the world. And so all of the props, all of the effects, all of the characters, all of the backgrounds are done in this sort of limited recursive color palette, where I create a language that then you can break for effect. When you create these patterns, you then create this sort of predictability, and then that gives you a real opportunity to create unpredictability, because you know where the audience's mind is going. And so for real dramatic effect, I can take a hard left and I can make things really different. And it feels like there's a big contrast there. And that's one of like the primary ingredients in storytelling too, is contrast. You need to have this, obviously, complement, but contrast at the same time. Otherwise, everything is one note, and you end up with really bland stories. So the more points of like real deliberate controlled contrast you can create, it just more tools you can wield to create interesting drama and stories. It was all born out of just sort of playing with these fledgling ideas in the comics that I could translate into TV in a way. that were super clear. And I think the show obviously evolves as well. If you watch the first season, you can sort of see us trying to play with these ideas and implement them. And then in the second season, it gets a little more sophisticated and we start trying new things. And in The Mountain King, it really, we had a good handle on it and we could start to play with like different ideas. And now, as we are working on our third season, we're really sort of able to control the process and go outside of the box a little bit in certain areas and stretch the show to keep it fresh and keep it dramatically interesting in terms of our visual storytelling.
Megan, I wanted to ask you, do you have any advice for artists who are interested in working on a series like Hilda?
Oh, so much. How many hours do we have? I would say, and this is just sort of like advice for really anyone getting into the animation industry is, bring your influences and your opinions with you. Don't water them down for the whatever job you may get. Sometimes we work in this industry and different jobs are going to have different expectations of us. And sometimes those expectations are, output and not, stretching those creative muscles, which is things that happen every once in a while. It's part of it, but don't mistake that for this is how the industry has to be, because a lot of where Hilda came from is from Andy, like pushing what the industry was saying it was. And I think that's been the big reward for when people come on Hilda. Like they want to, do right by the show. So I generally tell them is like, well, look at the scenes. What do you like about it? What sort of stuff do you want to get better at? Challenge yourself with that. A lot of if Andy didn't have an opinion or something he wanted to accomplish, Hilda would not be what it is. If I didn't have an opinion about wanting to have more of a voice in my career, I would have not been on Hilda. And I think having an opinion about how you want to grow, what you want to try, and then pursuing that is one of the best things you can have. And you're going to hit a wall every once in a while of maybe you're trying and you don't hit it, but that's the only way you grow. And that's how we connect with people. We get into animation because animation has influenced us and we relate to the stories and we want to be a part of it. And at the end of the day, it is not the hard skills like being able to execute a scene or being able to do a storyboard on time or being able to do paint a background. That's not the stuff that connects with people at the end of the day. The stuff that connects with people, like how animation connected to you, are the people on the show having an opinion and inputting themselves into it. And it makes for some amazing things that you would never think of. Like I had mentioned this before in like a YouTube video that me and Andy did, but like who would think that Hilda would have so many like horror movie references or Star Trek references, But I mean, that's part of the charm on it. And it's not, just Andy's opinion, but like people on the team, I love mushrooms. I love there's certain things that I like that or my life experiences that are in the show, and I wouldn't have been able to I think a lot about that. And there have been people who've worked on the show and have worked, in particular on the Deer Fox episode, who cried while doing their scenes because they're connecting with it. We don't always have a chance to dig that deep, but you want to always have that skill and that tool. So when you need it, you can pull it out. And if the job or the show you're on doesn't allow you to do that, that's fine. But don't get rid of it. Always have it. And I think that's what's going to push our industry further, because if we just keep kind of cycling with okay, well, the job wants me to do this, and I guess this is the job. No, shake it up. Bring in opinions, bring in your influences, try to input them whenever you can. That's my kind of baseline advice for sure.
Yeah, Megan, as you were saying before we started recording, this industry this craft is only about, what, 100, 120 years old.
Yeah.
So there's still time to make changes
Oh,
and
absolutely.
bring things forward.
Yeah, totally.
So,
Yeah, sorry.
sorry, I was just going to say, I can see that we're running a little bit over time. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we conclude the interview? Or
I don't really have anything in particular, really. I think I would just like to impart on everybody how proud we are of the show that we made, and we really love it. And it's something that I would love everybody to check out if they haven't already taken a peek at it. And it's not over yet. We are going to be sort of concluding this series with the upcoming third season of the show that I can't divulge anything about at this point because it's a little too early. I wish I could tell you guys about some of that stuff, but it is going to be great. That's all I can really say. Like, the work is shaping up so cool, and I am so pleased with it. So I hope anybody who has checked out the show is looking forward to that. And I think Hilda is just a beautiful, fun experience that I'm hopeful we can build on and make more stuff like this, because it, to me, is very special.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, Andy and Megan, and thank you to all our viewers for joining us for the Animation Trends event. This is our first 3-day virtual event hosted by Toon and Boom Animation, and be sure to visit toonboom.com to see our full schedule of free interviews, panel discussions, and live art events. You won't want to miss any of it, so be sure to tune in to the next interview.